This new Adobe Photoshop Preferences tutorial is really meant for those who have recently upgraded to Adobe Photoshop CC 2021. Typically, historically, every time Adobe has upgraded the programs, they're going to upgrade a few features here and there. So I wanted to make sure that I cover those. Sometimes, as you'll see in this video, brand new features I don't even take advantage of. They're so new, I don't even know what they do yet. And they haven't really affected the way I've worked. Half the time, I don't like when they upgrade the program because it worked fine just the way it was. But eventually I'll get used to these settings. So I just wanted to make sure I covered the Photoshop CC 2021 Preferences Edition. So again, here in Photoshop, if I'm on a Mac, I can go to Photoshop and Preferences. If you're on a PC, you would go to Edit and down to Preferences somewhere down here. But I'm going to go to Photoshop menu, Preferences in general. And right up here, most of these settings are the same. If you're in Adobe Photoshop, go with the Adobe Color Picker. That's pretty much like this color panel right up here. HUD means Heads Up Display. This is your hue strip right up here, so you want to keep it as a small hue strip for selecting colors. Image interpolation, it means interpretation. How does Photoshop reinterpret image pixels when you're transforming or rotating or scaling? I just keep it on bicubic automatic. That's been the default for the last 25 years and it's worked fine for me, so no need to change that. Couple of new things here. Auto update open file based documents. I've never had to use that, so I'm just going to keep it off. I mean, obviously, I know it does something, but it's never affected the way I've worked. So instead of complicating the issue, I'm just going to leave it off. Automatically show the home screen. That is a given. That's the list of recently opened files when you first come into Photoshop. Anytime you see the word legacy, that means use the older version. So if I am used to working in Photoshop for years or decades, I can use the older window for creating new documents. You might as well just keep up with the current technology. So I just keep that off. Why be stuck in the past? Go with the current updates to the program. Skip transforming when placing. Let's see, let's hover over that for a second. Determines whether a free transform will be shown. I can skip that. It's usually when I place a document into Windows or into other files that are open in Photoshop. It's going to ask me if I want a transformation dialog box or a transformation bounding box. I don't need that either. Okay, use legacy free transform. I'm just going to go with the free transform that is current here in Photoshop CC 2021. Beep when done. That's really a throwback to 20 years ago when Photoshop was really, really slow. Anytime you applied a big filter or whatever, your program would beep literally when it's done, like a microwave. They're pretty simultaneously now, so you don't need that. Resize images when I place objects. Yes, I want to do that, especially if I'm dragging from one image to another when they have different resolutions. Always create smart objects. I do not recommend that. A smart object is like an advanced layer feature in Photoshop, and I don't want to confuse the issue, so I'm going to keep that turned off. I can click next. And the color theme, this gray is your gray theme around your workspace. I'll keep that as it is. On all of these, you can just see right here, if I go dark gray, that's going to be this typical area right around here. Okay, I'd want to leave that as a medium gray. Full screen, just keep it on. Let's see, let's go with what full screen has. Black. Let's go medium gray on that as well. Standard screen and full screen will be medium grays. When you enter full screen mode, I have another demo later for those. You enter black. The main thing, I'm going to keep these all at medium gray. That's your default right there. The main thing is your borders. Okay, sometimes you're going to have it set to drop shadows, especially in Photoshop CC 2020. And that can get a little blurry along the edges of your files, especially if you have a gray drop shadow and a medium gray workspace around there. So I want to set all my borders to lines. Okay, all the rest of this is default. We'll leave it alone. I click next. These are all defaults, so I'm going to leave them alone. I'm going to click next. These little yellow bars that hover, that pop up when you hover, those are called tooltips. So I want to take advantage of those every now and then. Rich tool tips. I'm kind of stumbling over my words here. Rich tooltips. Let's see the difference between those. Determines whether to show more descriptive tooltips. Okay, we'll keep that just in case I need more details. Gestures is when you're working on things like an iPad or things like that. Use Shift key for tool switch. Absolutely, you want to keep that turned on. Flick panning, you want to keep that turned on. That's when you zoom in on a file, you can flick it just like you flick an image on a cell phone screen. And enable flick panning is good. Double click layer mask launches select and mask workspace. That is a new feature here in Photoshop CC 2021. And if you're working on layer masks and they're working pretty good, but you really need to refine things, you can double click your layer mask and enter the select and mask workspace, which is an even more refined method of editing masks. Very round brush hardness based on heads up display vertical movement. That's how you resize brushes, and that's how you make brushes harder or softer based on movement of your mouse. You want to keep that on. That's been around forever. Arrow keys rotate brush tip. Determines if the arrow keys can be used to increase or decrease the brush tip angle. I've tried that with the mouse, doesn't really work, so that might be a feature for the Wacom tablet or a graphics stylus pen, which I don't have, so I'll just turn that off. Anywhere I see the word snap, I want to turn that off. Snap means move objects into exact locations, like to the pixel grid, and you might see objects kind of jump around a little bit, and I don't want that to happen. So anytime I see the word snap, to me, that means turn it off. This is a new feature or a new option, and you absolutely want this. Show your reference point when using the transform. Okay? If this is turned off, you don't have a point of origin for your transformations. And showing a reference point when transforming, that's how Photoshop has worked for the last couple decades. So I want to make sure that is turned on. I don't use my scroll wheel on my mouse. If you prefer that, turn that on. Animated zoom means when you have your magnifying tool, you can click and drag to the right to zoom in, click and drag to the left to zoom out. You do not want the whole window to resize as well, so I turn that feature off. Anytime I use my magnifying tool and I click on an object, let's say I have a friend standing way over here, when I click on them with my magnifying tool, they will jump back into the center of my workspace, so that's kind of nice. Instead of them flying right off the edge of my screen, I make them zoom back into the center, so that's good. For the history log, I turn it off. I don't need it. For file saving, all of these are defaults. What I really want to pay attention to is image previews. I always save an image preview. That way, when I look at the little icon on my desktop, it looks like a tiny little stamp of the file that I made. Otherwise, you just get a generic blue PS square and you don't really know what the file is. And most important, append. Append means add. Add file extensions to everything that I do. So you want these both to say always. The difference between a Mac and PC, PCs are more specific, so I want to use always lowercase letters, .psd for Photoshop document, or .jpg for the file extension for a JPEG. Always, always. Under quick export, I leave this alone. These are default settings. Don't really use them anyway, so I'll just keep them on default. Memory is the amount of memory dedicated from your RAM to run Photoshop. So if you're working on, let's say, a little laptop and you're kind of running out of memory or things are slowing down, maybe lower the amount of history states to 20 or 25. History states is the last 50 things that I have done in my Photoshop file, and I'm asking my history panel to remember the last 50 things. Well, I don't make 50 mistakes, so I might want to lower that down to 20 if my computer is running a little slow, and then just restart everything and you'll find a little better performance. Okay, under scratch disk is your hard drive space where you access memory to run Photoshop. So that is my hard drive. I leave it alone. Under cursors, you want to keep your main cursors. A lot of Photoshop tools work with cursors. You want to keep it on the default normal brush tip. That's going to show you a ring representing the radius of the amount of information you're about to change or paint onto a surface. You don't want standard because that's going to show a tiny little brush tip icon if you have the paintbrush selected. And the problem is this little paintbrush icon could represent 10 pixels or it could represent 3,000 pixels. So you don't know what that means, so you don't want that. Precise is even worse. Gives you a little target or a pointer or crosshair. That can be really, really difficult to see on your page, so I don't like that. I just go with the normal brush tip. That's the way Photoshop's worked for the last couple decades, and I'm going to leave it alone. I don't want a full-size brush tip because that's going to show the very outer boundaries of the spray. I really want to see the core amount of paint that I'm dropping onto that surface, not the overspray like if you were using a spray paint can with soft brush tips. So I keep it as a normal brush tip. I don't want to show a crosshair because that just gets in the way. I don't want to show a crosshair only while I'm painting because then it keeps turning on and off and on and off. And I don't even use brush leash. I don't even know what that is, okay? I'll be honest. Never had to use it, so I'm going to skip it. Other cursors, if I'm working with my eyedropper, I want to see the eyedropper. If you need to be more precise, you can set it to the crosshairs, but typically a standard cursor will work fine. When you are resizing or making brush tips harder or softer, you can see the preview of the brush in red. That's your default brush preview, so I keep it there. Anytime you're in Photoshop, if there is nothing there, you're going to see a medium light colored grid. That does not mean you have painted a checkerboard pattern. This grid means you're looking at nothing. Layers act like sheets of glass stacked on top of each other. So when you see this transparency on a layer, that means you're looking at empty glass. You're looking at nothing. Okay, a gamut warning is a color test. When you are doing work digitally, you are displaying colors on your screen electronically, artificially. So some of those colors that look really bright, almost fluorescent on your screen, they're not going to necessarily print that way. You don't have fluorescent green ink in your desktop printer, but you can make it look like fluorescent green on a monitor. So a gamut warning is a color test to preview which of your colors in your files might not print correctly. And when you run a gamut warning, the colors that will dramatically change are going to turn gray as a preview. It's pretty shocking how many colors actually change when you go from monitor to print on paper. Okay, I'll click next, and units of measurement, rulers, I always set mine to inches so I can make an 8-inch file by a 11-inch or 8.5 by 11, like a sheet of paper. I measure everything in inches. In all the applications, type is measured in point sizes. Your default resolution for a photographic print, any file you do in Photoshop that you intend to print, should be set to 300 pixels per inch. Any files that are meant to only be viewed on screen should be set to 72. I would recommend you just set everything to 300, because once you start at 72, you're not going to be able to add resolution to it. It doesn't work that way. You can't add more detail into a file. So I just start everything at 300. Okay, you'll be better off that way. I'll click next. A lot of little colors floating around here. So guides, you will be using guides this semester, especially if you're in my class. So guides, I set them to red. The default is cyan, which is light blue. It's hard to see on a screen. So I set them to red. I set my guides as solid lines, not dashed lines. Solid lines are easier to see. I don't really use artboards, so I'll just keep that on its default. Smart guides, you don't want them showing up the same as your regular guides, so the default is magenta. If you are lining things up according to a grid, you can set up the size of the grid. You can divide 2-inch squares into smaller sections. You can do your grids as lines, dashed lines, or dotted lines. You can change the color of your grids, whatever you want to do with those. I don't think I'll be using those in my class, but you do have the option to lay down a grid on top of your layout to help you to line things up. I don't teach about slices. Slices is for web design, and this is not a web design class. Paths is what you use with the pen tool. We'll be focusing on that in my Photoshop chapter 10. It's all about using the pen tool in Photoshop. You can set up the colors of your paths now. In the past, they always used to be gray, so it's nice that you have a color. You can also set up the thickness of your guides so they're easier to see on screen, which is nice. You get a little preview of what a guide would look like, or a path would look like. And controls, I don't really use this feature either, so I'm just going to leave it on default. Okay, next. Let's go next. Come on. All right, there we go. Under plugins, plugins are additional filters and effects that you can buy from third-party software developers to add more functions to Photoshop. I don't have any of those. But what you do want under plugins, there used to be 3 buttons down here. Now they've moved one of them up here. Show all filter gallery groups. Show me all of my filters. In Photoshop CC 2020, this button was way down here. Now they've moved it up there for some stupid reason. So make sure that is always turned on. When I click next, these are all your default type settings. I'm not going to change anything on that. I don't like when I click with the type tool like in Illustrator, I get Latin text called placeholder text. I don't want that turned on. I'll type in what I want to type in. Don't just put in a bunch of junk there. So I leave that off. And the last 4 you're not going to be dealing with. You're not going to be doing 3D art in my class. Let's see, show touch bar property. Well, touch bar I believe is for pads and things like that. So I'll just leave it on. It's not going to affect me anyway. Technology previews, enable content aware tracing. I haven't really used that. So I'm going to leave that off for now. Let's see what it does if I hover over that. Make paths or shapes, follow the edges in an image. Well, what the heck? That might actually make tracing a little easier. So I'm going to turn it on. Okay, it also says that will not that will take effect until the next time you start Photoshop. So if I turn this on, I might have to quit and restart Photoshop. Let's see. To enable, check. Let's hover over that. To enable, check Enable Content Aware Tracing Tool and restart Photoshop. To use it, select the Content Aware Tracing Tool. If it is not present with the other pen tools, you may need to add and customize the toolbar. Okay. I don't know. I don't want people to get used to allowing the computer to do most of the work for them. I really want people to know how to do it themselves, because sometimes the computer is going to make a decision you probably didn't want to do. So I am very hesitant to use that. I'm actually going to turn that off. I'd rather people know how to use the pen tool than to just say, hey, computer, do it for me. I'm not going to use that. So I'll turn it off. Product improvement. This is if you'd like to participate in like beta testing, other garbage like that. I don't want to do that. So I'll keep that off and I'm going to click OK. So now I have set up my workspace and the engine that's under the hood, the preferences to work the way I want Photoshop to work. So I can do a great job in my classes from now on.